What's happening in the canine industry? For all the latest news, views, and expert opinions, stay right here for the Canine Paradigm. You'll hear from industry leaders, experts, doyens of the industry, learned colleagues, movers and shakers, and the odd randy guest. Get the latest insights and expert advice from both here and abroad from the people in the know. Now, here are your hosts, Glenn Cook and Pat Stewart. And I'm Lofty Fulton, and I'm out of here.
Linda?
Yes.
We have to do a new ad.
We do.
It's a solemn time. Our long-time sponsor of the show, George Kittredge,
Yes.
very, very sadly passed away. And we formerly used to advertise for him his Rowdy Hound boxes.
We did.
So we don't actually know what's happened with Rowdy Hound boxes. You know anything about that?
I looked at the website. It said that they're recalibrating since their founder and boss has passed. But nonetheless, I think that you and I want to honour the memory of George
Yes.
Kittredge anyway. He was a friend to both of us, a hell of a good guy, and he supported us almost immediately. He was on board through and through, and I just don't want any of us to forget George. He was a terrific human being.
So we intend to continue to advertise Rowdy Hound even though we don't know what's going on with them.
Yep.
In the hopes that they keep going and that can be a bit of George's legacy that we're able to
I hope
continue
so.
to promote.
I hope so.
In checking it out, we had a look to see, because we're not real good with the sponsorship. So we had a look to see who's actually paying for sponsorship. And
Yep.
we have a list of people to tell you that we support. And the first is our sugar mama, Barbara de Groot.
She's been with us from the start as well. Barbara's been an absolute staple in our...
She's a gem.
She is a gem.
She has a business.
She does. From the Heart Dog Training.
From the Heart Dog Training.
Yeah.
You can check it out. But she supports us as much and more than anybody ever has. So we appreciate you very much, Barbara. Another person who's supported us from the start,
the Einzelwiener.
Heinz Wiener,
The Bullfed.
the Bullfed.
Yep.
It's where I get all my stuff.
Yeah.
It is, truly. It's where I get all my dog gear. If I need something, Jason's my first point of call. I don't use his shit website. He has a website. It's dog shit. I just message him directly. You guys probably should use his shit website, but I
Yeah,
don't.
because you don't want to message him directly and get his grumpy
Yeah.
ire of the day.
Yeah, but do it. Get all your dog stuff from Jason. He's got everything you need. He's got all the shit that you need to train a dog for realty.
Everybody who comes to seminars and looks at mills and asks me mills questions, ask Jason.
Yeah.
Jason can point you in the right direction for getting the mill that's best suited for you.
I really like his leashes. I'm a big fan of his leash pack. That's
Yes.
why I sort of convinced him to do it. But anyway, get your stuff from Einzelwiener.
Yep.
Do you know who has a fantastic website and ships internationally?
My wife?
Your wife,
Yeah.
Canine Pharmaceuticals.
I couldn't imagine her not having a good website, how much of a perfectionist she is.
Well, the products are amazing. My dog merely being alive is a walking testimonial to that. My dog, who I've retired numerous times and has come out of retirement when I've managed to get his body back to healthy. And a big part of that is related to Canine Pharmaceuticals. So check it out, everybody.
I could say so many nice and biased things about Canine Pharmaceuticals and my wife, but what I will say is ignore me. Just look at testimonials. The testimonials speak for themselves. That's
Yeah.
where the field trials are working. What makes Narelle's day, and mine as well, is when people are emailing in and sending messages of, well, primarily people have had no hope in the past because just everything that they were trying wasn't working, and now it is. And that is the testament that something is actually really working. And the other thing which I will add, one of the things that Narelle's told me in the past is dogs are incapable of understanding the placebo effect.
Oh, that's a good point.
So you can fake it on a human, but you can't fake it on a dog.
I never
So-
thought about that before. That's
Yeah.
actually a really good point.
Well, my wife's actually a very smart person.
There you go.
So she's told me that humans are subject to the placebo effect where dogs are not. So it either works or it doesn't on dogs.
There you go. That makes total sense.
Yep.
There's one other person who puts a fair amount of work into this show.
Yeah.
It's me.
Yeah. Funny about that.
And I have a digital product that you can buy. If you go to my website, seriousdogbusiness.com, right now I've got 2 courses available to you. The Overview, which is a small course where you could learn how I teach.
Yep.
But the other one is the Wave Tops, which is a bigger course. It's everything I know about dog training. Well, it's not everything. It's a lot of what I know about dog training.
Yeah,
Check it
terrific.
out.
Yeah.
$500 dues. That's all it's going to cost you.
I recommend it when people are saying, what do I do? How do I get in the industry? I recommend them to your course.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks,
Yeah.
sir. All right, on with the show. Welcome back to the Canine Paradigm. I'm your host, Pat Stewart. I'm joined in studio today by my co-host, Glenn Cook.
Here we are, ready to go. What are we talking about?
We're going to hook straight in.
Are we?
Yep.
Okay, that's unusual for us.
I know.
Let's do it.
Tracy Ratchich. We did ask her how to say that properly when she was on the show, and I've forgotten. I apologize. So I hope I said that correctly.
Likewise.
She says, we had a great and lively discussion the other day on if it's appropriate to be luring or redirecting during a go-home session after a board and train. What are your thoughts?
I think what you should do is assess. You should assess the capability. You should take the dog home for a couple of days, see where the dog's at. And if the dog doesn't need it, then don't do it. Progress. If there's no need to scale backward, then don't scale backward. If you need to do it because you're incapable of following up with what the trainer has done, like your personal skills aren't up to a level.
I think she's talking about if you are the trainer. So I think it's...
Then I misinterpreted. So.
Yeah. I don't know. I interpret this to be... We had a great live discussion the other day. If it's appropriate to still be luring or redirecting during a go-home session after a board and train. So I interpret that to be the dog has been with you, and when you're doing the handover lesson back to the handler, you're still having to lure the dog into the positions or redirecting the dog away from the triggers or whatever during that time.
That all depends on what the promise is to the client.
Yeah.
If you've given the client an indication that you're going to resolve all the issues and you've given an expected period of time, let's say, for example, with most people, board and trains these days are 3 weeks to 5 weeks. So if you're talking about establishing better behaviors or eliminating others, anywhere between 3 and 5 weeks is really where it's at. And they're modifiable. They can be done. Some people do 4-week courses, some people do 6-week courses. Doesn't really matter. What matters is what did you establish with the owner of the dog that was going to be done? And during the period of time that the dog has been in and you're doing your ongoing assessment criteria with the dog, what are you conveying to the owner of the dog?
Yeah.
There have been dogs in before that I've had in for board and train programs, and on a week-by-week basis, I'll touch base with the owner of the dog and I'll say things are either going really, really well, or they're not going as well as I anticipated, and I've got some holdups. Like there are some exercises that I'm just finding there are resilience in the dog and that's created some real sticking points, and therefore this isn't going to be up to a standard that I believed it was going to be by the time you come to pick up the dog. Here is the reality of the situation. So either A, we extend, or B, we work on what the dog is doing well, and I also show you what to do as a carryover with the dog, and then like how to progress it when you take the dog home. And then when you come up to do your follow-up lesson, we can assess and see where we are. I feel that the way to answer that question, if we are in fact answering the question to its validity, transparency is the key here.
Yeah.
I feel that one of the ways to resolve most problems with people, whether you're doing personal training with them or you're training their dog for them, is to have complete transparency over any given situation. And I feel that that's probably where a lot of people, when they come to blows and when there's intra-web arguments going on about it, it's over a lack of transparency and communication, or it's been a honest communication breakdown. But I feel that when you are directly relaying what's going on in a blow-by-blow situation and you can establish that there are some genuine problems that have come up, people are quite willing to take that on board and listen to it. And if they have trust with you and a trainer, and in fact they should have, if they've been willing to leave their dog with you for a period of time, I feel that I've had some really genuine and some terrific conversations with people where I've let them know the implications for pushing the dog through the behavior at that point in time based on the dog's age or based on how the dog is having a significant amount of big feels with the situation. And people have trusted me and they've done the right thing and said, if that's what you think, let's readdress this in another format.
Yeah, I think that board and trains typically, like I think in America, board and trains are done fairly differently. Like I think it's culturally more normal in the US to send your dog out to be trained.
Yeah.
Whereas in Australia, people tend only to do that when there's a problem, right? So like I think in the US culturally, it's quite a normal thing that you get a puppy and you sort of deal with that puppy in the very young puppy phase. You just enjoy that.
People do it with their horses too in the US. It's very much, as you said, sort of like in a cultural
That's normal.
appropriation.
And like I think that actually the hunting world influences the rest of the dog world really heavily, right? So like you look at e-collar use in the US versus Australia, there's a lot of cross-contamination now, so things are blurring. But typically the e-collar usage in the US has been more of a negative reinforcement style use of the e-collar. So teaching behaviors with the e-collar. And in Australia, that's not a very popular thing. It's becoming more popular, but it's not a very common thing. Mostly what people tend to use an e-collar for in Australia is an aversive stim type stuff. And when you follow that back, the biggest hunting community with the use of dogs in the US is gun dog, field retriever type stuff, where they're using the e-collar for send out. So like, I think that whether people realize it or not, the grounding in their information has come from the hunting world, and whether you're involved in that or not, you have been influenced by it. And so the more negative reinforcement use of the e-collar, we see that in the US. And in Australia, the main use of hunting with dogs in Australia is pig hunting. I feel pretty strongly that that's the case. Like if you were to count the number of dogs hunting pigs versus hunting anything else, it's probably the highest. And the e-collar really isn't a useful tool on a pig dog beyond the stock proofing. And so we're more culturally used to using the e-collar in a punishment style, aversive stim, don't do that, versus in the US, they're more do that.
Yep.
And so, that's speaking fairly generally. That's, of course, there's exceptions to everything. But similarly, in the US, because of the background in gun dog stuff, it's pretty common. Like, it's like Pat Nolan told us all about it when he was on the show. Like people would send their dog out to be trained. That was his job, training other people's gun dogs for them to compete with.
Yep.
Not saying that doesn't happen in Australia, but that's much less common in Australia.
It is. Especially for sporting or trial events.
Yeah. So usually in Australia, by the time you're doing a board and train, it's because there are behavioral problems with the dog. Whereas it's much more common in the US to get like, here's my dog, turn it into a trained dog for me, whatever time period that takes, right? Now, of course, there's both in both countries.
Yep.
Not saying that it's strictly one or the other, but typically that's the case. And so for board and trains that you and I see and have done, you're almost always fixing a problem with a dog. It's very rare that you're teaching a dog sit down, stand, loose leash walk. Like you're going to teach those things as a
supplementary.
Yeah, because that the training of those things is going to assist you in the actual problem that you're fixing with the dog. But usually the dog's aggressive or reactive or is deadly fearful of something or destroys the furniture. Like there's usually a reason for the board and train beyond I want the dog trained. It's usually fix this specific issue with the dog.
Interesting that you say that. That actually transposes from behavioral into health. It's the same sort of thing, is that people are generally reactive instead of proactive on a lot of those fronts. I know the examples that, just speaking to Narelle, is that she sometimes says, I really wish that I could have helped this dog much earlier in its journey and some of the magnificent things I could have done all the way back then. I have had that conversation a myriad of times with creditable trainers all throughout the years.
Yeah, of course.
You and I have had that exact conversation where we think if only that person would have thought of us instead of thinking of us as a last resort, because the planet internet has scared the bejesus out of them. And says, don't go to these people unless it's a last result. Whereas if they'd only come to us as a first result, imagine how amazing that dog's life could be.
Yeah, it'd be totally different.
Those things sit in my mind quite a lot. And sometimes I think I sound like a crazy evangelist when I'm jumping up and down and I'm screaming to the Mount Olympus about these type of things, because I'm so passionate about the fact of preventative measures in both health and training dogs. And I really wish I was part of that preemptive journey.
Yeah.
But when you're watching the shit show unfold around it and you're just thinking, oh man, like this is going to take so much time. If there's any capability of rescuing it all, it's going to take so much longer because of the residual that's now hanging around this dog's training or health career. It's almost crazy and sad that that's allowed to coexist.
I guess my answer to your question then, Tracy, is it depends on what's been happening. It depends on the length of the board and train. Depends on what the purpose of the board and train was.
Yeah, exactly.
To give a little bit of detail, like if I were teaching a dog the monkey drills and it involved sit down, stand, I would expect before I were giving the dog back and calling it a trained dog, I would want to have faded the lure, for sure. Like that's what I wouldn't consider a dog trained until I'm at an indirect reward with a verbal cue. Like that's, you don't have a trained dog until you have that.
That's the meat and potatoes.
But I also don't think that getting the owner to lure the dog a little bit is a bad idea either. I've done quite a lot in my time of training dogs and then handing them over to other people, or like training a dog to do something specific that is somebody else's dog and then giving it to them. And, lately our next question's about outing. Like lately I've been doing a decent amount of outing stuff. I've worked on outs with military working dogs that say, "Hey, give me the dog for the day, and at the end of the day, I'll give you back a dog with a clean out."
Yep.
But there's a bit of a process to handing that back to the handler. And I don't think it's a bad idea at all to, if I've taught a dog to sit and to down and to heel on a loose leash, and I've got all those on command and no visible reinforcer and the dog does it, it makes sense to me when I'm handing that dog over to the owner to regress a little bit to help the dog fully understand what that owner's saying. Because I think that sometimes we take for granted how contextual all of our cues are and all of our body language type cues. So like an example of this away from the pet dog stuff is at the moment, we just talked about it before, at the moment, somebody in our club is learning to drive my dog and is going to do a PDC with him. And it's been really fascinating to me to see, I've learned quite a lot about the subtlety of my cues when my dog won't do the things that he's told to do by somebody else. And he's in the habit of compliance. Like, it's not like he's like, no, you don't tell me what to do. It's that there's more than just my verbal cue, right? So my heel is pretty good. My sit and down, they're pretty good. Like, they're just straight verbal cues because those are things that I know in my game I'll be assessed against the dog being able to do that without being able to see me. So I've put the work in. But other things that rely on you for a reference point, like recently I was trying to get her to have my dog go between her legs, like into a middle. He just wouldn't do it. And not like, hey, I'm not doing that for you, but did not understand the command at all. And then it was actually Jazz that pointed out, because of the way he enters the position, to create space for him to enter the position, I kind of opened my left hip a little bit to create space for him to move in. And that clearly became a very strong criteria of the behavior to my dog because that's the cue to go into the middle. And so I think that it's highly likely that as a trainer, there are little funnies like that you're going to put into all the dogs that you train. There's little peculiarities that you do. Jay Jack had a very funny segment many years ago on his own podcast about how he was trying to change languages on his dog and was going to reteach everything to the dog. And his plan was to do that via classical conditioning. He was going to give the new command with no signal, wait 1 second, give the old command with the known signal. And when he gave the new command, the dog did it. And he was like, oh, that's weird. I think that he didn't have the dog from puppy. And so I was like, that's weird. Maybe somebody else already taught you this. And so he's like, I don't want to risk that being a scar. So changed it to another language and tells the dog to do it. The dog does it immediately and cycles through a bunch of different commands. And the dog's doing exactly what he ultimately wanted it to do, but doing it first time around before he realizes that he gives a subtle head nod that is the actual cue.
Yep.
Right? I've had that with my own dogs.
It's what you call the poker tell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it is probably not just reasonable, but a good idea to regress a little bit and have the owners kind of reteach the behaviors that you've already taught. So it makes total sense to me, and this is what I've done plenty of times in the past, in a few different formats where I will tell the owner, like, tell the dog to sit, this is how you should lure the dog into the sit, and then this is how you pay the dog. And then within 5 to 10 reps, we can get rid of that lure because the dog knows it, but it has to be generalized to that person. So I don't think the fact that at a go home session, there's a little bit of luring still happening. If you're still luring the dog, sure, you should reflect on maybe your board and train need to be longer. Maybe you need to put more work into it. Maybe you're having issues with your sequencing and that kind of stuff.
Maybe it's time to find a new career.
Maybe. But I think that having the owner do a little bit of it is probably not a bad idea. To the point where, like, I posted a video a long time ago of me doing it with my kids, where one of the things that I do with dogs that I've taught the out to is, especially if it's off of a decoy, is the same thing. I get the owner to say it and then I say it, right? And then I get the owner to say it and the dog doesn't necessarily do it, and then I say it and the dog does it. And before too long, those signals are paired and the dog does it when they say it. So like that's essentially the same thing. We're doing a handover of it. And it's the same when Rip was finally old enough that I thought, okay, I'm going to give you the keys to the dog a little bit, right? And teach you how to control him. It was the same thing. He tells the dog to do something. I wait 1 second. I tell the dog to do something, right? And like the dog realizes, oh, this command carries the same value. I'll do it when he says it.
Yep.
So I think that's reasonable. But I'm sure the conversation that they already had around this probably revolved around that. Like, if you're still requiring that, maybe your board and train needs some reflection. Maybe you need to be better at it, or you just need more time. I think that's appropriate as well.
I think the transparency thing needs to be relayed across the entire. Like, if there's problems, if there's genuine problems, rather than covering them up or feeling that there are some inefficiencies. I remember the first time that I trained an English bulldog. You know, the English bulldogs with their muzzle joins all the way up to the top of the skull. Some of the most stubborn fucking dogs I've ever trained in my life. The first time I trained one of those, it was like training a Bessabrick. It had the intelligence of a Bessabrick as well. And I really, really struggled to get some of the most basic things out of a dog. And at that stage, you know, like I was doing well training dogs until I met this dog. And I thought, what the fuck? There was so many mixed feelings going on because I just thought, what's actually happened here? I was trying to blame the dog for everything. And then I came to the conclusion of, I haven't trained many of these dogs before. It was a lovely dog. It was a really happy dog, but it just didn't really cotton on to a lot of the advanced skills that I was trying to train at. And other breeds were sailing through them. I was getting a bunch of golden retrievers in at the time and they were just hurtling through it. And I just thought, yeah, this is cake. It was fucking awesome until I met this dog. And it was like my worst nightmare. And I was having a really bad time because I was like 2.5 weeks into a 3-week board and train and the things were very, very basic. And I took it really, really personally. I was conflicted about the whole thing. I was going through my mind about how do I cover this up? Like, how do I fix this situation? But I then I rang the owners and I said, listen, it's 2.5 weeks in, it's Wednesday and you guys are due to come out on Monday to pick this dog up. And I said, I am having a hell of a time getting him to do anything. And the two of them, husband and wife, they were both talking to me on the phone at the same time. They were fucking howling with laughter. They said, oh yeah, we've been to other people before and they've told us he's the dumbest dog they've ever met in their life. I said, why didn't you lead with that when you first brought the dog to me? You know, like I said, I've been suffering with this the entire time. And they said, look, you've got a good reputation. We thought if anybody could help him, you can. And to be honest, they loved what I taught him to do when they came and picked him up, but I was really unsatisfied with them. So I ended up not charging them for it. I just waived the fee. I said, I'll charge you the boarding fee, but not the training fee, you know, for the dog to stay in the kennel because I have to pay the kennel owner. But I said, I won't charge you for the boarding. I'm just not happy with it. And they said, no, we'll pay. And I said, no, I won't take it. I said, if you come and do some private lessons with me later on, we can talk about it then, but just not charging you for it. Because it just wasn't up to a standard that I was willing to hang my hat on and put my name to. It really created some inadequacies within me, but it helped me actually become a better trainer. The way that it actually helped me become a better trainer was I just didn't ask enough questions about this dog when I first brought him in. Like I just took him in and thought, yeah, I'm fucking super Glenn. I can train any dog that comes my way. It just showed me that I still have some vulnerabilities to deal with and not all dogs can be pigeonholed into that same sort of breed characteristic or that same trait where they'll just immediately have an uptake of obedience and everything will be okay. It really forced some deep reflection. So I'm glad it did. I'm glad that happened to me because sometimes you need the wind taken out of your sails to realize what fucking good wind actually really is.
Yeah, for sure. That's a funny one.
Wasn't at the time.
Yeah, I bet. All right, we got this one from Susan Cleveland. She says, you've just met a dog who's been brought to you for help improving the out. Is there a Rolodex of little tests you run through to figure out which direction to go?
Why don't you talk on that? You've been...
Yeah, so for me, lately I have been doing a lot of outing stuff and I've really been enjoying it. I've been sort of on my... I think that's what happens when you have a couple of things, you know, like for me, things end up happening in batches because I have a couple of dogs that trigger my interest or curiosity, whatever. If I make content about it, then that invites more of those dogs into my life, which is exactly what happened. So I had a couple of like in real life fixing outs and then made some content about it, spoke about it on the podcast, and then the inbox gets full of dogs with out issues, which is great. I'm very happy with that. For me, when I'm teaching a dog anything, because like we're not talking about a dog that's going to be my dog. It's not talking about a board and train. These are dogs that people come to me to fix a specific issue with. And lately I'm very lucky. I have the capacity to do whole day training sessions with people.
Yep.
The way that things typically work for me now is people can really only book me for the whole day. You come in and we spend the whole day. The dog probably gets worked 3 or 4 times, but we sort of unpack everything, get to know what's going on. The first session I see the same look on everybody's face where they're like, oh, I've wasted my money. Right? Like, what have I done?
Yeah.
Because in that first session, I just kind of fuck around with the dog, right? I just kind of like, who are you? And just sort of feel out who they are. And I might want to see the issue, but I just sort of want to watch the dog move around. I want to watch the dog interact with the handler. I want to know what happens when I take the leash. I want to know, how do you play? How do you feel about that? How do you take food? Like, I just want to sort of see all of this with the dog. And there is a mental checklist that I'm going through, but it's not very formal, right? Like, I just want to sort of feel out the dog and see, what happens with you? How do you respond to these sorts of things? I might put a bit of spatial pressure on you to see what you do, right? I might, in the game, get, a little bit defensive with you and see what happens, right? And just kind of feel out the dog and see who they are. And then I say, okay, we're done. Put the dog away. They go put the dog away. And then we go around the whiteboard and we go, all right, here's our training plan, right? And we start figuring it out. But when I'm doing outing stuff, the first thing that I'm sort of interested in is I want to see the handler attempt the out. Seldom is anybody, or never, has anybody come to me saying, my dog has no out. I've never even tried. Can you please teach the out? More often it's like, I have this disaster, right? Can you help me fix it?
Yeah.
Typically, the first thing I want to do is see them attempt to give an out. And what I am looking for straight up is, what's the dog's understanding of that word? Because if the dog gives no change of behavior, like nothing happens, then I'm like, okay, well, he doesn't know it, right? We're teaching it out from scratch. But that's rare, right? You might see that there'll be some stress will come over the dog. We might see that the dog will actually bite harder and get deeper into it. Quite a lot of people's out is actually their bite command, right? They don't realize that. So that's what I want to do, is I want to see the sort of first reaction to the command. And then I want to see what happens when the game stops. Like, I want to see, how does the dog try to reinitiate the game? What kind of stress happens at that point? I want to see how the person handles it when the dog doesn't out. And I usually tell people, like, pretend I'm not here, you're playing with the dog, and just do what you would normally do. I want to see the way that they respond to that. I want to see how many times they give the command. I want to see what sort of words, if any, they say between giving the command. I want to see if they put any pressure on the dog, how that pressure looks like, what that pressure looks like, what kind of tool they put that pressure with, and how does the dog respond to that pressure. I want to look at the entire body language of the dog before hearing the command and after hearing the command, and see what changes in that space. The reason I want to kind of know the dog a little bit and have brought the dog up in arousal and down in arousal and play with the dog a little bit prior to this is, I want to see, how does the mood of the dog change after hearing the out command. So those are the things that I'm looking for. And from all of that, I'll then develop a plan on how to make the dog out better.
Just listening to what you're talking about then, I think what you just described is some of the most important parts. Even though we have our differences in things we do, we're similar in many ways. And that's probably because we've spent a long time together and, you know, like we've learned from each other over the years. And I would probably put you and I into a category what I call a diagnostic dog trainer.
Yeah.
And it's somebody, because I need to do this a lot of times when I'm working with dogs that have been deemed dangerous and so forth. And even dogs that in the past where I've taught outs or I've taught dogs, one of the things I developed a good reputation for is teaching dogs to speak. Like people who could not get their dogs to speak when they were doing hold and barks or anything like that. Many of the steps that you were describing before, like when you go through this diagnostic treatment, you have to pay attention to the small detail, the things that everybody else is rushing their way through. Again, they're just not being incremental enough about diagnosing how do you feel about this situation or what do you understand about this situation. And if we were able to sit down with a human being, like in an analytical or a diagnostic situation ourselves, you would ask those questions. You'd say, why do you do that?
Yeah.
If you're trying to diagnose why a kid said something stupid to another kid, you'd say, why did you say that? What was going through your head at the time? You might get some incoherent garbage come out of their mouth at the time, but if you're reasonably skilled at your job or you're a little analytical about how you peel things apart, you generally arrive at some kind of truth to the situation. And I feel that should happen in dog training. If you're worth your salt, you shouldn't be rushing. And doesn't matter if the client doesn't entirely understand the situation. They came there because they don't understand at all.
Yeah, exactly,
When they came to you. I've seen that face before where I've sat down and people aren't running around with fireworks and streamers and, like there isn't a fanfare going on. And that's kind of what they projected in their mind, like something amazing is going to happen. Like this is going to be a Hogwarts experience for me. And yet when they come, it's so vanilla sometimes because you really need to peel the onion apart. You've got to try and find out what's going on here. Why do you think this way? Or what happened to you in the past to make you believe that this is the way it's done?
Yeah.
And then you have to arrive at that point in time is where is that little node of corruption along your lifeline? Where did this all go so wrong? Being part of that skilled diagnostic expert is to pull back to that node and then slightly before it to say, this is where life was pretty good for you. This is where you understood exactly what you were supposed to do. So when you were sharing your parallel journey with your handler, like you knew exactly what to do. But for some reason, you hit this cross section here and you split apart. And that's where I need to fix it right there. And that takes time. That is a real difficult but a real skilled thing for dog trainers, but it's as boring as fuck.
Yeah.
It's moving at such a glacial pace when you're watching that process go through and people are just so unimpressed with it. But big things are happening. Like an incredible, momentous movement is occurring at that point in time because once you have cleared up that blockage and once that corruption point has been dissolved and you're moving ahead, everything is fucking smooth sailing from there. And suddenly it's like somebody turned the lights on in the room. Everything that was dark and there was no revelation, now suddenly the dog is going, I fucking get it. I really understand that. But it's as boring as batshit for the observer.
Yeah, that's it, right? The dog get it. And to out specifically, off the top of my head, like of course there's subcategories of everything, but there's probably 3 ways to teach an out, right?
Yeah.
Like the first through just non-reinforcement where we just kind of lock up, freeze up, the dog eventually lets go, you let the dog back in.
Yep.
The other, that sort of 2-tug method, like where this one becomes less interesting, this one becomes more interesting. And then finally sort of the out off as a reflex response, sort of taught off from a hold, right? So we're teaching the dog to hold something just so that we can teach it to let go. There's subsets. There's different ways to do all different things.
Because that's an important identification too, right? Because they're 2 different behaviors where people think of them as one.
Yeah.
Like people think of bite and out as one behavior, but it's not. They're 2 opposed behaviors.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's still 2 behaviors, and that's what people have got to look at. Is they've got to look at as people who are invested in or teaching bite work, we're so invested at the detail of the bite that we forget about the detail of the out.
But even if it's not, like, to make sure that we don't lose a bunch of the audience, it's not just a bite work thing. It's the tug, it's the ball, it's everything that you need to let the dog
is hanging on to.
Yeah. And so I think on outs in general, like we probably should do a whole episode on outs, but I think that how you teach it, that depends on the timeline, how you want to do it, the type of dog. Like there's lots of different ways. But the crux of it has to be that the out is a behavior. So most people think of the out as being like stop biting the thing. And so long as you have that as your mindset, as being out means stop biting this thing, there will always be conflict in your out. It cannot mean stop biting the thing. It has to mean do this specific thing, which is incongruent or incompatible or can't happen at the same time as biting the thing.
Yep.
Right? So long as you think that outing is just about teaching the dog to let go, you will always have problems.
Yeah, because one is punitive.
Well, but then
one method of thinking is punitive, and that's where the dog starts to come into conflict with it.
It's exactly like we read it all those years ago, the Monkey Puzzle book. You're telling the dog what not to do, but you're not telling it what to do.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's a problem in that the dog then is like, okay, but then what? Right?
Yeah.
And so the crux of the out has to be that it has to contain enough criteria that the dog is actively doing something in its mind. Once you can come around to that, then it becomes really easy. And the dog usually is pretty happy and compliant doing it. And I've taught some outs to some dogs that were the unoutable dogs, right? One in particular, I have to choose all my words carefully, but one was an extreme military working dog. And I showed the handler, I said, you're out. We have to rebuild. We have to pretend this is a dog that you've never met before and reteach it its out from the ground up. because he thinks his out command is his in command. And it was this whole ordeal to get the dog off of anything. And then we had the dog in a sit on the table right in front of me. And I said to the guy, I was like, say apples. Apples. Dog sits there. Say bananas. Bananas. The dog sits there. Say out. Out. The dog fucking nails me, right? So I'm like, I can't give you any more evidence than that, right? We have to rename this command and teach it from scratch. Didn't want to do it. Eventually, the dog gets a new handler. I teach it out in 40 minutes, right? It's not like...
It's not rocket science.
No, because...
But it is a science.
Because so much of like, a pressure that happens, it's one of the fucking things people must be so sick of me saying this, but a pressure that happens within a behavior without altering the behavior becomes an activator / reinforcer of the behavior. So if you tell your dog to out and he doesn't, and then you put pressure on the dog and that pressure doesn't get the dog to let go fully, right? If the dog fights through that pressure, even for a fucking moment while you rechange your grip or go get different equipment or whatever, you just in that moment gave a signal that predicted a pressure, and the outcome, the way to turn off that pressure is by biting fuller, harder, deeper. Yeah,
on last week's session, we talked about negative reinforcement, and there's your
exactly
right there.
That's it. And so once the dog has the idea that word out means bite fuller, harder, deeper, of course you could keep the same word and re-educate the dog. You could, but it makes more sense to just change it completely.
Yeah.
And show the dog like, hey, this shouldn't be stress inducing. You shouldn't panic over this. You shouldn't start to load. Like when you see a dog, especially, like police dogs that have to have the stop fighting the dog, like they have to have all of the preamble and they practice all of that preamble. When you see the dog start loading, you hear all of that preamble and the grip falls apart, the dog starts getting hectic. To me, that's a pretty clear sign there's an outing problem, or that the dog thinks of the dog still might out nicely, but he thinks of the out in a very negative way.
Yeah, it's punitive. That's the problem, is the dog isn't having like a winning outlook at this point in time. It's not thinking, oh, this is great. If I let go, my life is going to improve exponentially. It's thinking to itself, if I let go, what the fuck is going to happen?
Yeah.
Am I going to lose? And usually what happens in those sort of situations, what did used to happen is the dog would go through all this effort to get the bite. Everybody's praising on the dog and loving on the bite. Then the dog gets choked off into an out and thrown in the car.
Yeah.
So then the dog thinks, well, I don't want to do this. My life sucks. As soon as I'm doing this other behavior, everything starts falling apart from me. It doesn't believe that its life gets exponentially better.
Yeah.
And that's generally, it's not seen as a unique behavior, which leads to another form of reinforcement.
Yeah.
The potential to bite again, the potential to get given food, the potential to do something awesome after that behavior.
To just sequence into other behaviors.
Exactly. It just thinks of my life literally starts tipping into the toilet as soon as I hear that out command.
Yeah. The other one on the outing, again, no matter how you teach it, sometimes I've seen or I've worked with people who do a really good session, they make improvements on their out, and then they steal that from themselves completely by the way that they end the session.
Yeah.
Right. And
exactly.
Like they out and they retain the toy and the dog is still trying to get it. So the dog's like, well, you cheated. And they don't have clear ending the session signals. Right.
Yep.
So like there's a lot of layers to it that, let me be clear, almost never is the answer more pressure for getting the dog to out cleanly. Every now and again, you get a dog that's like, fuck you, I'm not doing it. I know exactly what you want, but under these circumstances, I'm not doing it. So you say, yep, no worries, here's your correction, right? Or here's your punishment for not doing it.
Yep, and that's justified as well.
Yeah, when we can identify that that's the case.
Yep.
But you have to identify that. For the most part, it's like, no, this is how I need you to feel about the out. And generally, I've got a video I've been sitting on. I don't know what to do with it. I should put it in the Patreon. I think the video is maybe 20 minutes long. I've got a dog that doesn't out all the way up to a dog that is outing off of a toy that's active. Like I'm actively keeping the toy playing and the dog's outing powerfully. And the dog thinks it's winning a game when it's outing.
Yep.
That's all that's important. That's really all that's important, is that from the dog's point of view, that by letting go of the thing, it's doing a specific thing, it's winning the game via doing that specific thing, and it's doing the thing, not doing a thing.
Yeah.
That's what's important
Yeah,
about
he
the outing.
no longer sees it as being a punitive.
Yeah. It's awesome. I love being told to out because that predicts something awesome happening.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? That's my rant about outing. When last time I was at the ICP conference, Tobias Gustafsson was talking there, and he said something that just spoke deeply to the core of my soul. I sort of like, when he said it in a room full of people.
We'll share.
Yeah. Was that he said, early on in my career, I decided I was never going to have any outing issues. Right.
Yep.
And I just remember thinking, oh my God, I thought the same thing. Like, that's just not something I'm prepared to roll the dice on. And I remember Bart telling me he felt the same. He's like, the in and the out. I remember having a conversation with him. He's like, so in PSA where you got the change of position, right? You're going to take your dog from a down to a sit. What happens if your dog doesn't do it? And I said, well, you get to give the command again. Okay. So what happens if he doesn't do it that time? You get to give the command again. Okay, what happens if he doesn't do it that time? You lose those points and you get to continue. What are the points? Well, that change of position there, it's a 3-point exercise. He's like, okay, cool. What happens if you tell your dog to out? You get to give the command again. And he still doesn't do it? What happens if you tell your dog to out? Doesn't do it? You get to give the command again. What happens after a third time? You're disqualified.
Yep.
It's fucking over. So in one instance, your dog doesn't do a change of position, you just lose those points. Yeah, you could still pass. You could still be in the 90s. Things could still go really well. If everything else was really nice, you could still win.
But not for outs.
Dog doesn't out, it's over.
Yeah.
Right? But similarly, here's the rub. The dog has to in first. Right? What's really important is that in the teaching of the out, you don't degrade the in.
Yep.
Right? And I think that's something.
That's a very, very good point.
Yeah, so that's something that is BiteWorks specific. Although,
yeah, but that's why the two exercises can't be melded together. They're
different things.
They need to be thought of different things.
Yeah, they're different things. And we teach the in, for example, literally just the other way, like we're in the process of teaching it right now. The dogs that Jazz is raising, they're like 11 months or something like that. We're coming up on 12 months.
Yep.
She's had an out and we've had an out off of toys and they've outed off of toys from me, but we're now ready to put them on a suit. So we're going to need an out, right?
Yep.
Like in the bite work. So the last session that we did was a progression of outs. Like the whole point of the session was outs. We've been building the in for 12 months,
Yep.
right? Now we're like, okay, the in is how we like it.
Yep.
Now it's time to teach the out. And all the equipment that we've been able to slip along the way, we're now no longer slipping. And we start the session with they bite a wedge from me and they out from that with on her command. And I'm teaching the guard type behaviors, what I want to see after it. I want them to be into a behavior, a specific thing after they let go. Then I let them regrip. We do a few reps on the wedge. They got it. Sweet. Okay. We go to the chomp. We do a few reps on that. Cool. Got it. Then go to the leg sleeve. Okay, cool. Got it. And then we go to the bicep sleeve. Okay, cool. Got it. All right. Now we're ready to progress to the suit. You have to think of the out not as this like, oh, that means letting go. Like you got to be like to the context of the dog. Like, no, it interrupts what we're doing, causes like a coiling of tension, which you love, and then an explosive action out of it.
Yep.
And that'll happen onto a wedge. That'll happen onto a chomp. That'll happen onto sleeves. Like you got to convince the dog of these things. But what we see a lot is people go, well, he outs from the ball for me. He should out off the suit for you. And it's like, oh, there's a few steps before there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
There's a high level of intensity with a man in a suit compared to just a free-flowing ball.
Yeah, so we've got to build
Can
that.
be. I mean, it depends on the dog too.
Of course, depends on the dog. All these things depend on the dog.
They do.
Our next one is from Jane Purden. She says, how to reduce intensity / build calm stability without losing enthusiasm and motivation for the task. Specifically referring to my little dopamine junkie who squeaks and stamps feet every time he hears his marker. He is now comfortable putting the hold object in his mouth, but it's very frantic. Or do we stay here for a while to build more enthusiasm before we clean it up? Goal is to carry a small posy for a wedding procession. So I'm guessing the dog has to carry
Posy?
Posy. Yeah,
Yeah.
posy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Like
like
a
a ring
flower.
around a posy. Yeah, okay. Pocket
Yeah.
full of posies.
Yeah.
I get it. What do you reckon?
Read it again.
How to reduce intensity / build calm stability without losing enthusiasm / motivation for the task. Specifically referring to my little dopamine junkie who squeaks and stamps feet every time he hears his marker. He is now comfortable putting the hold object in his mouth, but it's very frantic. Or do we stay here for a while to build more enthusiasm before we clean it up? Goal is to carry a small posy for a wedding procession.
It's a hard one without actually seeing the dog doing it. I mean, we're talking about something ethereal, so a lot of things are jumping around in my head. However, if I was going to answer it with the contemplation it deserves, I would probably say that you probably need to stretch it out a little bit more and incrementally work it back until you're not getting those leaking style behaviors from the dog.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you got a couple of options. Like one is to bring in some NEPO into the behavior that you can use to calm the dog down.
Yeah.
Another one is to typically with food, especially, it's what we were talking about a long while ago when we're talking clickers, is that with the clicker, I want this like insanely fiery, immediate action, big response. But I also want some low grade markers as well. Like I want to like, hey, that was good. You did the right thing. Calmly take some food. Don't make a big deal about it, right? Because I want to be able to kick the dog into that huge action when that's appropriate. But I also want the dog to be calm at other times. And so having a marker for that kind of receival of food, I think is important. And so teaching that kind of stuff. So in terms of your hold, getting the better stability around the hold is not done in the hold, right? Like it's done elsewhere. And it's by loading a set of markers around doing that is appropriate, like keeping the dog at that lower state of arousal, but still understands the job, as well as potentially calming the dog down a little bit. And that's like your kind of slippery style pressure is what is often pretty good for that. When we're doing those hold exercises, I'll never forget at a lot of the NEPO post schools, the hold exercises is one that gets practiced quite a lot because not because it matters that the dogs can hold things, but because you get to, it's one of the reasons why I teach it at all of the boot camps I do and make it a big learning event. Not necessarily because that's how you should teach a hold or a retrieve or whatever, but because the process of understanding that helps you understand a lot of the processes around dog training, right? The way pressure in relationships to its behavior, markers and all that kind of stuff, right? So there's a lot to get in there. And I remember one day watching a guy with an off-tap dog trying to teach the unforced force fetch.
Yep.
And it was a fucking shit show, right? Because the dog is like explosive power to do everything. And it's chomping all over a pipe and it's hearing its clicker and it's losing its mind and it's like all this. And then Bart just got up and he goes, no, this dog's not suitable for this. And he just like, no food. The positive side doesn't need to be here. And he did like a more traditional force fetch very eloquently. So like not the toe hitch, right? And within 30 seconds, the dog's very calmly holding the pipe.
Yep.
I think the bigger picture answer to Jane's question here is not like how do you fix this issue. The answer is create a version of the dog that doesn't have that issue and then use those markers, that style of teaching to teach this behavior. Because you can have that, right? You can have modularity in the way that the dog acts. You want to be able to bring your dog really high in intensity and have certain behaviors that are performed like that. You know, your recall for one, depending on, I don't think there's anybody that would say, oh, my recall's too fast and too efficient, right? My dog's too enthusiastic about a recall, right? Like you're not going to hear that. Doesn't matter whether you're the most intense working dog person all the way through to Nana with her toilet paper dog. Like nobody's upset the dog came back too fast and too intense. So there's that. But then there's also those slower behaviors. And I think that you've got to have the ability to bring your dog into the right mindset.
100%.
To perform the behavior in the way that you would like the behavior performed.
Very well said. As you're talking about that, and I was thinking along, there's certain behaviors that we do ourselves to get some speed and to get some enthusiasm in what you're doing. Ultimately, it looks great when you're doing certain type of behaviors. You could name a bunch of them. But there's other things that we do which are essential behaviors where they're calm and they're poised and they're balanced in how we do the delivery of it. And what made me think of that was there still is a trainer around who was back in the day was teaching a bunch of people here about training dogs in drive. The mixed information that people were getting was that the dog's got to be in drive and doing this exceptional behavior all the time, like literally be running flat chat. Now, that might not have been what the trainer was relaying to people, but that was certainly
That's what they took on.
That's what they took on. That's the interpretation they had with it. I remember reading in forums people saying, now I'm living with a dog that's just completely erratic all the time. Now when I'm going out in the backyard, the dog is jumping on me, pulling my clothes. What they were primarily saying is my dog now doesn't understand that there is a certain amount of downtime that's required for certain behaviors. And when we want to cue the dog on and teach the dog, well, I want this fast, because that's the explanation and the requirements around the exercise. Now the dog understands. This behavior doesn't require that. This behavior does. So if I say to you, for example, run to the letterbox and get the mail out of the letterbox and run back as quickly as you can, well, I've given you a specific set of instructions. So if you walk your ass up there, take your time, stand at the letterbox, just count the mail out and then sulk all the way back home, expect a kick in the ass for it. I'm not talking physically, but I'm saying, there's going to be consequences for doing that. And if you do it, expect some form of reinforcement. Like if you do that behavior, you can say, well, I carried out what you asked. What am I going to get for it? And you get reinforced. You think there's merit in doing that way. But if I just say, look, can you just go to the letterbox for me and get the mail? You don't usually ask people to run to the mailbox as fast as they fucking can, rip the mail out of the letterbox, scatter it all over the place, then have to pick it all up, run back to the house and then just throw it onto the kitchen table. That's totally unrealistic.
Yeah.
Like you give people specific instructions on what you're supposed to do. Unfortunately, we've got a bunch of people out in the communities who are misinterpreting what training and drive or heart and soul training is. Like there's a whole generation now of people who I watch them online overdeveloping their dogs in ordinary everyday situations. They don't understand
Making the dogs frantic.
Exactly right. So they don't understand that there are certain criteria which the establishers of these training programs are saying this is not required all the time. It's goal orientated. It's around certain types of behaviors and usually for trial sort of situations like the recall. Like when we're trying to build enthusiasm in the recall or we're teaching a dog to come to place or do a nice healing or something like that, we're certainly asking the dog do that with as much enthusiasm as you possibly can. But again, we don't want the dog to miss the point or the handler to miss the point and lose focus with how the behavior is supposed to play out. As Bruce Lee used to teach when he was teaching Jeet Kune Do, he always used to say, have technique first before you build speed.
Yeah.
He said, everything will be a disaster unless you build out that technique first.
Yeah.
And he said, speed comes from technique. And it has to be the same with dog training as well.
Yeah.
Again, being diagnostic about these type of things, when I'm watching people's behavior and when I'm looking at how did this come to be so terribly wrong or how did it become so terribly annoying. And it's generally that people have built speed before they built technique.
Yeah. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast.
Exactly. That's the old commandos saying, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's an army one. Yeah, for sure. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. And I think as well, it makes sense sometimes depending on the behaviors. But I usually try and teach behaviors in the lowest form of arousal that I can get the dog into, right? So like sometimes depending on the behaviors, that it's still pretty high depending on what the reinforcer is, the circumstances, blah, blah, blah. But I want to try and create the lowest form of arousal possible so that the dog is able to think clearly.
Yep.
That's the main thing. And then I can build all that up. And, it's another catch cry, like speed comes with understanding. You can speed things up just by having the dog know it's in their interest to do so, right? They don't, like when they know the behavior, they know exactly how to do it and they know that it leads them to reinforcement or the possibility of reinforcement. The speed will come, right? Like it will come naturally by itself. And there's ways to speed it up when you want to as well, right?
I haven't talked about a guitar thing for a while.
Oh, go, do it. This will round us out.
My thoughts on this all the time is no matter how fast I want to be when I get excited about doing a medley or doing a chord progression or so forth, I can only go as fast as my skill and talent will allow me to do so. The times that I have tried to outpace myself because I'm becoming excited about it or I'm just trying to push the limit on it, I always get schooled every fucking time. It never sounds good anymore. Like it sounds terrible. But the great thing is I'm witness to it and I can comprehend what's going on. Whereas people don't do that for their dogs. They give their dog a mixed message and now the dog thinks, isn't this what you wanted? And for some reason, that just goes to show that we've created that little node of corruption along our training pathline because now the dog believes that's the ultimate behavior that you're rewarding. So somewhere along the line, you have to say to the dog, that's not even close to what I wanted. But it's my fault that you believed it to be that way. And let me show you how to bring that back down because I think there's nothing worse for a dog where it really believes that it did everything exceptionally and then there's nothing that exists for it other than punishment at the end of that. And then the dog is literally, if it could, it'd be sitting there with its shoulders and hands in the air going, what the fuck is happening here? What's going wrong? Part of being a compassionate trainer as well, not just a successful one, but being a compassionate trainer is making sure that that doesn't happen. Well, there's an infrequency of that happening. If we can reduce that as much as we possibly can by saying to the owner of the dog or even to yourself, let's not rush to the end of the goal. Let's just play out the journey and see how our student is progressing along the time. Because ultimately, that is the true testimony and measure of a good teacher, is working within the confines of the student's capability. And if you're not going to do that, then you really should rethink your strategy about teaching.
It's a good one. I've got one more catch cry to add to all that.
Please.
Speed is good. Accuracy is final.
Yeah, nice. Yeah.
That's some cliche right for you there.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, it's good.
All right. I feel like that's the place to end it.
It is a good place to end it.
All right. Well, friends, that's it.
Friends.
Yeah. That's it for another episode of the Canine
Friends,
Paradigm.
Romans, countrymen.
Yeah.
Give me your Patreon dollars.
If you like what you hear, give us a like, give us a share, rate, subscribe, do all of that. Do that wherever you listen to the show. If you're an iTunes guy, do it there. But then do it somewhere else.
Tell other people.
Yeah. Honestly, the way that you can help the show the most is by telling people IRL that they should listen to the show.
It's remarkable when I read some of the comments prior to approving people into the discussion list. And there's people in there that goes, I've never heard of you guys before, but I've been binging the episodes and I fucking love it. Now I'm addicted.
Yeah.
And I kind of
Those
think
poor people.
that's what I'm thinking. I think, how did you not?
I feel terrible for the people who write and say like, oh, I've just found the show and I'm binging the whole thing. Because people have written to us with their 300 something episodes that they've gotten through in 3 months. Right. And
Isn't that a horrible thought?
I had one guy email me and was like, I'm fucking dreaming in your voice. And I think, you poor sons of bitches having it because if you've been listening the whole time, you can hear you and I kind of evolve, right? Like in me especially, I've changed a lot as a person over this time. You can hear, well, I know that I have, I'm sure you have as well, but I feel it in myself. It might have been entertaining for people to be on that journey. But if you hear all that at once, I must sound like the most contradicting motherfucker out there, right? Because it's like, well, just 2 weeks ago you held this opinion, Pat, but your 2 weeks is actually like 2 years.
Yep.
Right? So anyway, apologize for that. Enjoy the show. If you want to support the show, make sure it keeps going, give us some Patreon dollars.
Yeah, just do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lamborghinis ain't cheap.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Even Lego ones.
Yeah. I'm thinking about getting one of those Scrooge McDuck safes, so we can swim around in money.
Mate, I think we'd just fucking crash into the concrete at this point in time with a couple of dollar coins on the bottom.
No, but we appreciate all the money it gives us.
we
It
do.
goes to buying our cool stuff that we use to create more content.
Indeed.
I appreciate it more than anything. One thing that a lot of people, I make all those reels, or I have someone make reels for me that I really am, of course I'm marketing. I want people to buy my fucking course, but I feel very happy about being able to put that information out. Like they're not so much teasers anymore. Like I'm actually able to give real tangible bite-sized chunks of information. And that's only possible because we're filming on a camera you guys bought me. That kind of stuff, like it's not unnoticed. That's where the Patreon money goes to. We buy cool gear that allows us to continue to make cool stuff for you guys. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You could also get a t-shirt
Absolutely.
or a tapestry. You could wear that as a cape. You could get that.
That'd be amazing.
Yeah, you get that from Spring. Links in the show notes. If you
You could
want
be like Homelander, only TCPer.
If you want to get in touch with us, best way to do that is to jump in the Facebook discussion group.
Yeah.
All these questions that we've been answering lately, that's where they're all coming from.
Yes.
If you want to email us directly, shoot us an email. We are info@thecanineparadigm.com. Love you all. Goodbye.